Hello, everyone. Welcome to week 4 of research methods. I wanted to record a quick video just so we're all on the same page. So week 4 began February 5th and it ends on Sunday. So you have 2 more days to get all of your assignments done for this week. This week we are covering module 4 in D2L, and you're supposed to be reading through chapter 3, which talks about ethics and criminal justice research. And then you have the MindTap material for that module as well. So if you go over to content and then click on module 4, which corresponds with your course schedule, you'll see everything under module 4. I did also mention a final exam that I was going to post to you. I should have posted that last week, and I'm a little bit behind on that, so I apologize. So your final exam, don't forget that that's due May 20th, and that's worth 20 points. So it's not that many points, but you should still be working on that as you go. So I am going to post that for you by tomorrow evening. Don't worry, it's not going to be, it sounds like a lot because it's 5 pages long, but it's not. I promise you it'll be a lot easier than you probably think. It's mainly going to be summaries. So if you look at the end of each of your chapters, you should see the chapter summary and the key terms on each chapter. So you can expect to see that on your final exam / study guide that I want you to really use for your future classes and take that forward with you. So at this point in the class, we've already covered chapter 1. Chapter 1 talked about crime in general, criminal justice, and scientific inquiry. So if you should have already completed all of that content, but I wanted to do a quick recap for you and just to tell you that, research methods is talking generally about how we conduct research and specifically how we conduct research in criminal justice. So first of all, to start thinking about research methods, you have to ask yourself, how do we know what we know? And of course, a lot of what we know is just from what we know from everyday living, and that's called direct experience. So we know what we know through direct experience, and we also know based on an agreement. So the learning objective for chapter 1 here is what I'm talking about. So you either know it just because you know it, which is called direct experience, or you're just agreeing on it. Some other key things you should have picked up on chapter 1 are tradition versus authority. So those are important sources of knowledge. And another important one would be number 7. So although we do use systematic observation and research for criminal justice which is a social science, that doesn't mean that the research is not biased. It can happen, and it does happen. There's political beliefs that could affect research findings. There's also outside factors that could affect research findings. So imagine if you're working for a research foundation or company, and an organization hires you. You probably already know what they want to hear from you. So if you're a social scientist, would you let that influence your research findings? Hopefully not, but that doesn't mean it doesn't happen. So anytime you hear anything in the news or you read about anything, it's important to ask yourself, who funded the research and who's this person that did the research? If the researcher is somebody that does it blindly and has no financial interest in the research, you can rely on that a little bit more. But if you have research findings from a researcher that's directly working for the company or the organization, you should question the validity of those results. So are their conclusions or their summaries valid? A good example of this is sometimes, police departments, they may have their own data analysts that look at different outcomes. Police departments might source out this information to other researchers as well and say, okay, does our police organization have a problem with use of force or discrimination or any other issue that you can think of? Well, depending on who they hire, that could affect the research findings from one person to the next. So again, it's important to ask those questions. And you should have already learned this as well. There's different purposes of research. I hope you're enjoying the MindTap material, but if not, this is just a quick recap about why do we do research? What's the purpose of doing this research? Well, we might need to explore things, and that's an initial analysis of data. We might need to describe things as well. We might also need to explain things. So if there's already an issue going on, we need to delve deeper and see what's causing that problem. And then the last reason that you might conduct research would be for application. Chapter 1 also talks about how to design a research project. Now, there's really not a specific way to design a research project. So your textbook presents this idea of starting with an interest, an idea, and then perhaps applying a theory to that, finding your population or your data that you're going to use, then developing your research method. So are you going to do a survey? Are you going to mail out surveys to people? Are you going to do a content analysis where you ask them to write a paragraph and do some qualitative analysis? Are you going to do field research? So actually go out there and just see what's going on. So that's what your book's talking about when it's talking about research method. So the important takeaway I want you to take away from number 9 for moving forward is that there's not a specific way that you have to conduct research. Sometimes you might start with a theory and then you break down that theory and figure out what you're going to do. So let's say you're interested in labeling theory. So labeling theory says that a person, somehow comes into contact with the criminal justice system, or someone related to the criminal justice system, and then they're labeled a criminal or a deviant. Because of that label, then they start to commit other crimes because they internalize that label. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. They start hanging out with delinquent others, and they develop a negative self-identity, and so they conduct crime for the rest of their lives. So, for example, me, I am interested in the labeling perspective, and I think that's an interesting idea. So I might not have an idea about anything. I might just say, okay, as a theorist, I want to figure out more about once someone's labeled, how does that negative self-identity unfold? Are there different types of self-identities depending on who the person is? So how does it vary across different groups? So you can have all these questions, but you see that my question didn't come out from my own idea. It came out of looking at the theory first. So there's a lot of different perspectives that you could take when you conduct research. An important part of that is going to be able to conduct a literature review. So when you conduct a literature review, you could use Google Scholar, you could use university library sources, or just a public library as well. But the important thing to know when you conduct a research literature review is that you're looking at peer-reviewed journal articles, and that's why I recommend Google Scholar. So if you go to Google Scholar, you will be able to look at different articles. So let's say, like me, you're interested in labeling theory. You can put labeling theory and crime. Click search. And all of these results, because they're on Google Scholar, you can rely on these and know that they're written by criminologists and sociologists, sometimes psychologists, but they're definitely from social scientists that are written in peer-reviewed articles or in books and other reputable sources. And then last, if you're really wanting to conduct research, you should know how to write a research proposal. So that's basically chapter 1 in a quick rundown. And I noticed that I hadn't uploaded those lectures. That's why I'm doing that now, just to make sure, even though it's after the fact, I wanted to cover that and make sure that you know everything you need to know. You guys are doing great as far as the MindTap material, so it looks like you have it down. But I just wanted to make sure to talk about everything in chapter 1. And let me go back a second, because in chapter 1, there was also conceptualization versus operationalization. Now, I'm only going to talk about this for a second because those do come up in future chapters that we're going to cover. But conceptualization is basically like, what do you mean by whatever term you're going to use? So if you think about crime, for example, it's an easy one. So crime, are you talking about violent crime? Are you talking about all crimes? Are you talking about just drug crimes? What do you mean by crime? And is it crime according to what the government says? There's different definitions of crime depending on what jurisdiction you're in. Marijuana is a good example. So are you gonna include marijuana when you talk about crime? Are you gonna exclude it? That's what we mean by conceptualization. And then operationalization would be next. And I'm pulling this up for you really quick on the screen. All right, so your material makes it sound really complicated. Operationalization is the process of developing operational definitions that describe actual measurements. So the easiest way to think about this is just, let's say you're interested in speeding violations in a certain area. So your conceptualization of speeding would be very straightforward, right? I mean, you have the posted speed limit of 55. If they're going over 55, then it's speeding. That's, that's not as complicated as talking about, big crime. Crime, like I said before, you could be talking about drug crime, violent crime, all crime, a white collar crime. What do you mean? But speeding is pretty simple, right? So you have a conceptualization of speeding, but what about operationalization? How are you going to measure that? So you're going to measure it by every fifth car that drives by. You're going to record their speed and then come up with a percentage of people that are estimated to be speeding? Or are you going to just look at the number of tickets that are given out? But then how do you account for people that get it off on a warning, but they're still speeding? So that's a good example. So that's what operationalization, that's what that means. How are you going to actually measure it? All right, and I'm just going back here, seeing if there's anything else. All right, no, so that's basically chapter 1. There's some key definitions there, and there's some very high level things that you should understand: conceptualization versus operationalization, and then different elements of a research proposal. So you will not be writing a research proposal in this class. In other classes, I've had them do this, and they've had to come up with a problem statement, like looking at crime in a certain neighborhood. Then they had to do a lit review and see if there's any research out there. They had to come up with research questions, measurements, data analysis, references, APA, and everything. They did not have to add a budget in there. So you are lucky you do not have to do that. That doesn't mean you won't have to do that for capstone, no. So these are key elements that I want you to take with you moving forward to your other classes. All right, so chapter 2 is talking about more fundamental knowledge, that we use theories, not any type of beliefs. So a belief doesn't have any systematic thought process behind it, whereas a theory does. So when we're conducting research, you should use a theory. We're also interested in aggregates, typically, not individuals. So it's not to say that we cannot be interested in individuals, but more often we're interested in aggregates, because then that makes for generalizable information. So if you're interested in individuals, that can be great, but you might not be able to apply that knowledge to a large number of people, which is why we usually look at aggregate information. So these will definitely be key terms on your final exam that you need to write out. And by the way, the final exam is just a more more or less a completion. If you do your best on it and complete it to your best of your ability, you're going to get, all of the points on that. All right, so some of the terms you'll likely see on there is going to be attributes versus variables. So attributes are just characteristics of a person. They're straightforward, like you can think about them as demographic information, whereas variables are going to have different groupings. So an attribute would be, excuse me. So an attribute would be something like if you're married, divorced, widowed, versus employment status. So employment status could be you're unemployed, employed part-time, employed full-time. So for employment, if you're unemployed versus employed full-time, employed part-time, those are all attributes, and the larger grouping is referred to as the variable. So employment status, just to make it clear if I misspoke, employment status is the variable, and from there you're going to have different options that someone can choose. So if you have a survey and you have employment status, that's the variable, and whatever their answer is going to be the attribute. As a second example, a variable would be gender, and then their attributes going to be, male, female, etc. As a third example, a variable could be socioeconomic status, and depending on how you're operationalizing that variable for socioeconomic status, you could have low class, middle class, high class, or you could have 0 to 25,000, 25,001 through 40,000, and so on. So that's another example of operationalization as well. Another key takeaway for chapter 2 is quantitative versus qualitative data. Quantitative data, you're going to have, you're dealing with numerical data. So that doesn't necessarily mean that you're looking at numbers. It just means that, you might have a variable called gender and you have female, male. In your data, female becomes a 0, 1 becomes a male, and it's quantitative because those are numbers that you're putting into a program such as this. So this is Stata. You use this to conduct data analysis. And so you're going to have a bunch of numbers here, and you analyze numbers versus qualitative data. Now, it can sound a little confusing, but if it's confusing, just think about it this way. So quantitative is going to be, looking at surveys, turning everything into numbers, versus qualitative, you're really going to dive deep into what they're actually saying. So if you say, how do the police make you feel in your neighborhood? And you just let them talk and talk and talk, and you're looking for keywords in their paragraphs and comparing and contrasting that to each other, that's qualitative because you're looking at their written answers. We'll definitely talk about that later. But quantitative versus qualitative is a very big takeaway from this class. Again, there's conceptualization versus operationalization. And so if you need more examples about conceptualization and operationalization, you can refer to chapter 2 because they provide different examples that I've already talked about. All right, so that was chapter 1 and 2. And chapter 3 is ethics. So let me pull that up. All right, so chapter 3 is talking about ethical research issues, and a really popular one is the Stanford Prison Experiment. You might have already heard about that, perhaps in an introduction to criminal justice class. But if you haven't heard about that, make sure to read about that towards the latter part of chapter 3. So that's a great example of how researchers don't always recognize when there's problems in conducting research, although we're a lot better today, and there's a lot more rules that exist as well. So now you have to receive IRB approval. There's also different compliance compliance requirements that you have to meet with certain departments depending on the type of work that you do. But keep in mind in criminal justice that a lot of data is actually a data analysis is done with secondary data. So primary data is going to be data that you get yourself. So some criminal justice researchers are actually out in the field. No, it's not a lot of people, but they could be out doing field experiments and working with people one-on-one. When you do stuff like that, you're going to be held to a higher standard, and there's more requirements that you have to meet to ensure that you're not, taking advantage of people or doing anything illegal. But a lot of researchers use secondary data. So secondary data is maybe somebody else did a survey and it's just an Excel file that you're downloading off the internet. For that type of research, you still need to do an IRB application, but it's going to go through because you're just dealing with data that's already been collected by somebody else, and you don't have any of their personal identification. Usually that's already masked for confidentiality. All right, so it's important to know about voluntary participation. So experimental participation must be voluntary. You've likely already heard about experimental participation. So these are instances where you may agree to be a part of a study and you don't really know if you're being subjected to the treatment or not. If you're thinking about receiving a certain type of medication, for example, you might be a part of the group getting the medication. You might be a part of the group being given the placebo. That's an example of experimental participation, and all participants have to be there voluntarily. Otherwise, the generalizability may be compromised. So going back to field research again, there is an ethical dilemma that surrounds whether or not to reveal what's happening, because sometimes that can affect what's going on in the real world. You also have an anonymity and confidentiality. So anonymity is exactly what it sounds. You don't really know anything about the person, versus confidentiality. You know about the person, you know their identity, but then you go ahead and mask that information. That way, that person's identity is not revealed to anybody else that was not involved in the original research. All right, so there is sometimes situations where you can deceive people, even though you may think that on its face that's unethical. Just be aware that if you are deceiving subjects, that usually you're going to be held to a stricter standard by your institutional review board. So you may have more explaining to do. You might have justifications that you have to make as far as like, why is this for the good of everyone else? What's the benefit to this? All right, another part of ethical considerations in criminal justice research is analysis and reporting. So usually part of any research article is going to be a limitations section. And a limitations section just makes shortcomings known to readers. So it might be funny to think about, but you have to do this. So even though you take all this time, let's say you take 2 years to do a study, you find some amazing results, you're going to have a limitation section regardless. So this limitation section might be, oh, I had too many people drop out of the study. Maybe I didn't capture enough people that were over the age of 50. There's a lot of different limitations that might come up. And if you look at any research article, you should see a limitation section. So I'm just going to pull up a random one, at least a more recent one than 2005. Let's see. All right, so this is a fairly new one. I want to show you how a limitation section should look. It's usually a part of any article. So I don't think I can get this one to open up correctly. It's not downloading the entire article. So sometimes you'll run across situations where you can't open up things because you have to pay. On Google Scholar, not everything's free. Let me try to open up something else. I mean, that one opened, but it just didn't look like it downloaded right. Okay. So I'm just going to Google, Control F to limitations. No. Sometimes it's labeled as something else other than limitations. It could be like a discussion. All right, these are not good examples, but I'm going to keep going to page 2 until I find one. All right. So this is a good example of an article. You'll have an abstract that tells you about the article in a few sentences, short paragraph. You'll have an introduction, the lit review. You'll have this is a lit review, so review of treatments. Then you'll usually have the data, the analysis, and at the end, you'll usually have either a section that says future direction or discussion, conclusion, limitations. There are different titles, but usually towards the very end of an article, you will have an area where you're going to talk about shortcomings of your data and of your study. All right, so going back to ethics, sometimes there's also legal liabilities that come up. So obstructing justice or also committing a crime yourself. So those are things to be aware of. And as I mentioned before, now we're a lot better with promoting compliance and ethical principles. We have codes of ethics. We have institutional review boards. You also have just employer policies. For example, me as a professor, I have certain, expectations of my behavior within the university, and then by the institutional review board as a separate board. So there's multiple components in place that help us conduct ethical research. Within criminal justice specifically, we also have different national organizations. So we have ACJS, that's the Academy of Criminal Justice Sciences, which I've been to, and I go to conferences and have presented there. I've also presented at the American Society of Criminology, or ASC. So those also have their own professional ethics that you're expected to follow if you're a member. Now, you don't necessarily have to be a part of those, But regardless, you're going to be part of IRBs. So during IRBs, you have to fill out paperwork, and usually other board members, which usually are other faculty, if you're at a university, they will assess your study to see if you've done everything that you've needed to do to protect the participants and protect their confidentiality as well. Special populations are going to be juveniles and prisoners, which is, of course, hard for people that are in criminal justice and want to study them. It's difficult for them to give informed consent if they're under the custody of, the state. So there are certain participants that receive a little more protection. All right, and then to end today, we have 2 ethical controversies that I mentioned that you may want to go over, or you will need to go over them, and I'm sure they'll be in your MindTap material as well. So the Stanford prison experiment is probably the more important one that I would want you to pay attention to when you're reading through your material, and then Trouble in the Tea Room as well. All right. So I will go ahead and post an announcement once I have your final exam ready for you guys. I'm going to send that out to you by tomorrow evening. And if you have questions in the meantime, please let me know. But you guys are all doing really well. If you need anything, please reach out to me via email.